If you like what you're listening to, support this podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com, search Phil Dawson, or find a link in the show notes and join up. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening. Chapter 13, Peace Talks. The offer of peace talks came after a year of semi-regular fighting along the northern desert borders of the Sword Marches. It caught Tanos and the rest of Yosha by surprise. The offer came without warning or preamble. A Falaji rider appeared at one of the Yoshan outposts under a flag of truce, bearing a message for the Queen of Krug from the Qadir of the Suardi. The message was relayed to one of the Ornithopter bases deep within Yoshan territory, and from there borne by air to the Privy Council at Krug. The council consisted of the Queen, the Sensual, the Captain of the Guard, and Tanos. For a brief period a year earlier, Urza had attended the meetings faithfully, but soon he began sending his apprentice as his proxy. With the arrival of the Qadir's message, though, Urza appeared in the council at the Queen's right hand. Tanos stood behind the Chief Artificer's chair and to one side. The apprentice noticed that Urza's eyes did not leave the ornately scribed scroll now spread before them. "An offer for peace," said Kayla. "An offer of truce," corrected the Sensual, with a slight quaver in his voice. "A cessation of hostilities, a pulling back of forces while peace is being discussed." "How bad are the hostilities?" Kayla turned to the Captain of the Guard. The newest captain, as he was still thought of by many, was a thoughtful man and paused before he responded. "Sporadic, but serious enough," he said, and paused again. The mannerism bothered Tanos, but the others at the table had grown used to the captain's habit and let him gather his thoughts. "They fall into two groups," he said finally. "One seemed to be traditional raid of the Falaji type, a rapid push into our territory, looting a random town or caravan they encounter, then retreating before our forces can arrive. The other type of assault is carried out by a larger, more organized force that seems intent on destroying a specific target, such as a bridge, a mill, or a fort. The Dragon Engine often accompanies these raids. There's less looting, but more destruction." "Those are the organized attacks," said Urza softly. "The others are just parties of desert raiders seeking their own loot and glory. The attacks of the Dragon Engine are more organized and have a firm objective in mind." His eyes did not leave the parchment bearing the truce offer. "Those organized raids have my brother's approval, and show his planning." "Approved or not," ventured the Sensual, "the effect is to demoralize the people of the Sword Marches and all along the River Marden. The Falaji regularly raid the territories on the far side of the river, and rumors swirl that they plan an attack across it sometime in the near future." "Are they indeed planning such an attack?" asked Kayla, her voice firm and her manner dispassionate. Tanos noticed that in council she usually let all sides speak, then made her decision. The Sensual looked at the captain, who paused, then said, "We have no knowledge at this time. We have fortified encampments on the far side of the river, with bonfire towers to warn us of any massed movements. The river's wide enough that even if they found or built sufficient boats, we would be prepared for any assault long before they could launch it." Another pause. "However, maintaining garrisons along the Marden stretches our resources even further." Kayla thought about the newest captain said, then nodded. "We can use the Ornithopters for additional patrols?" "Those resources are stretching thin as well," said Urza. "We have nearly 30 machines and 6 patrols of 5 each. If we get the power stones from Argiv, for which we have asked, then we can double that number. But the Argivian crown is being—" The lean man bit his lip. "Reticent." Kayla nodded again. From what Urza had told her, the Argivians were practically swimming in power stones, most of them from Torcasia's original encampment. However, it appeared that prying the stones from the ground was simple compared to prying them from the Argivians' hands. Instead, she said, "What is the status of the flights?" Urza answered while the captain was pausing. 5 of the flights are in the field at the base throughout the northern sword marches. The 6th is here at the capital. The sword marches flights operate from permanent bases. I was thinking that we could establish a series of such bases along the border and move the flights from one to another as need be. The captain frowned and said, "That would be taxing on the pilots." "We have more capable pilots than we have craft for them to fly," Urza replied. "The additional camps would give us sufficient maneuverability, increase our ability to respond, and perhaps they would give us the same element of surprise that the Falaji are currently enjoying. The captain shook his head. These pilots need their rest. Should the machines sleep just because the men do? Asked Urza. There was a brittle irony in his voice. Tanos had seen this battle before. When it came to the ornithopters, the master artificer held more sway than the captain of the guard did. The captain paused for a moment, then shrugged his shoulders in defeat. Kayla watched the interplay coolly, then said, Urza, provide any plans for multiple bases to the captain. In the meantime, it sounds as if we are stretched thin indeed. We have more than just ornithopters, said the captain. We have foot patrols, civilian riders, cavalry patrols. He paused for a moment and looked at Urza. But yes, the continual raiding has stretched us thin. Then we will accept the offer to talk. Perhaps together we can come up with a solution. Unlikely, said Urza. Their demands, made back at Corlinda, were direct and left little room for negotiation. They want all the land they consider traditional Falaji territories. That includes the sword marches. Are you prepared to give that to them? Kayla shook her head firmly. It is part of my father's legacy, for good or ill. Still, we will talk, if nothing else, to show that Yosha they deal with now is not the one they dealt with at Corlinda. She rose from her seat, indicating the council was ended. The captain and Central rose as well. Urza, however, remained seated. The chief artificer reached out and tapped the parchment. The question is, he asked Zetanos, are they the same Falaji we dealt with in Corlinda? The offer was accepted, and word was relayed back to the borders by Ornithopter. Negotiators set a date at the end of the next month, at Krug itself. A route of safe passage was proposed by the Falaji through the heart of the sword marches. The captain of the guard protested, and the Central counteroffered a route along the Marden River, just skirting the edges of the contested borderlands. The Central expected the Falaji to reject any deviation from their demands, but was pleasantly surprised when they accepted the alternate route without change. In the capital city of Krug, preparations were subdued. Anti-Falaji graffiti was carefully washed from the alleyway bricks, and the great open area was cleared before the city's thick walls for the expected troops. Again, the Central was pleased to discover that the Falaji would bring little more than an honor guard. He was less pleased to hear they would also bring the dragon engine. Urza and the newest captain took their own precautions. The palace troops were drilled to within an inch of perfection, and the normal garrison was supplemented by troops from the coastal regiments. They recalled a second flight of ornithopters from the sword marches to Krug to join the 5 craft already there. Urza wanted ornithopters aloft directly over the Falaji's procession as it moved south, but the Falaji bridled at this, making their displeasure known through the Central. For several days, Tanos was sure that negotiations would break down over this point, but Urza at last relented. There would, however, be a regular cavalry escort with the Falaji, were they in Yoshan territory. Urza also took pains to review all the pilots of the ornithopters at the capital, in some cases interviewing the young men himself. Tanos accompanied the chief artificer on several of these interviews, though he was puzzled by Urza's actions. Most of the pilots were hand-picked and trained by Urza in the first place, and were intensely loyal to the prince consort. As Urza talked to them, though, Tanos saw what the artificer was worried about. Loyalty was not an issue. It was assumed, and indeed, Urza was considered halfway between a legend and a saint by his pilots. His questions focused on how the pilots felt about the Falaji, about the desert, about the long-running battles they had been fighting. He was, Tanos realized, looking into their temperaments, trying to discern if any would, accidentally or purposefully, attempt to finish the job the warlord had started. He was examining them as if they were just another component in a larger device, checking them for signs of wear and tear. Indeed, there were 2 individuals who confessed a hatred of the Falaji, and one who promised his loyalty even when he disagreed with diplomacy. Urza relocated these young men to other flights and replaced them with even more even-tempered individuals. And considering Urza's actions, Tanos realized the chief artificer had been caught by surprise once before and did not want to repeat the mistake a second time. With a precision that the apprentice had previously seen the chief artificer dedicate to his inventions, Urza investigated every unit stationed at the capital. He knew every merchant who had claimed injury from the Falaji, and Tanos knew Urza had walked every inch of the walls that flanked 3 sides of Krug, and along every inch of the shore of the Marden, which served as the 4th protective barrier to the city. Still, the older man had little hope for the negotiations, and said as much to Tanos. The Kadir wanted nothing less than the land that Kayla's late father had conquered. He reiterated that she would not give it up. Then why negotiate at all? Tanos asked. Urza sighed deeply and said, Sometimes even foes should get together to talk. Nothing may come of this talk, but if the sides can discuss without incident, that gives hope for the next meeting. Tanos thought there was more than that. The meeting for which the chief artificer was planning so carefully was not Falaji and Yoshin, he realized, nor Queen and Kadir. The meeting was between himself and his younger brother. The messages started arriving soon after the Falaji reached the borders of the sword marches. Arriving at regular intervals as Urza had ordered, the Falaji contingent was smaller than that which they had presented at Korlinda, as the Kadir had promised. The dragon engine was present, but it was being used to pull a great metal wain almost as big as itself with huge gear-like wheels. While hitched to the wain, the engine moved slowly, keeping pace with the rest of the troops. The Ocean Council argued about the presence of the wain. The Sensual suggested it might be a gift. The newest captain thought it might contain additional troops. Urza told Tanos it was a display of power, a reminder that Mishra had not been merely resting since Korlinda. In the end, Kayla chose not to make an issue of the unexpected addition of the Falaji party. Urza ordered one of the flights, grounded at the border, to return to normal operations, and a second to parallel the Falaji party, remaining to the east and out of sight. On the fifth day of the Falaji journey southward, 5 days before the arrival of the party in Krug, there were new rumors of a massing of Falaji troops at the far northern border of the sword marches. The Central thought that, if true, it might be one of the more traditional raids, perhaps by individuals who wanted to see the negotiations crumble. The captain argued that, regardless of purpose, any Falaji incursions would be disastrous at this time, and the ornithopters were needed to scout in the desert. Urza at first refused, only to be overruled by Kayla. Reluctantly, the chief artificer allowed 3 flights, including the one shadowing the dragon engine, to be reassigned to the far north. Urza did not explain to Tanos the factors that convinced him to change his mind, but several of the household staff heard a series of row in the royal quarters. Tanos knew that Urza spent the next few nights working late in the orniary. The chief artificer claimed to be working on improvements to the Avenger-style automatons, but thereafter he attended the council only when specifically summoned by his wife. On the 10th day, the Falaji arrived before the walls of Krug. The battlements had been hung with colorful banners, as if festive bunting would conceal the strength and purpose of the stonework beneath. The walls were bedecked with most of the populace of Krug as well, as were the window of every building that commanded a view of the visitors. The merchants had made a killing selling telescopes, an Argivian fancy consisting of 2 polished lenses set along the length of a metal tube. Indeed, Krug seemed a city to observers as a Falaji party neared. Her Majesty, the Prince Consort, Tanos, and Sensual, and the newest captain waited for the other bureaucrats at the North Gatehouse for the Falaji to present themselves. There were fewer Falaji than there had been at Korlinda, and the sunlight sparkled off the polished brass of their wide helmets and heavy-shouldered ornaments. But few counted the number of men, for the dragon engine captured everyone's attention. Tanos, standing with the others at the gatehouse, was amazed by the beast. It was as if a living thing had been transformed into a machine. It was a dragon whose muscles had been replaced with cables, its hide with plates of metal, its eyes with great gems. It moved like a living thing as well, with little flinches and muscle ticks, swinging its head slowly from one side to another, apparently curious about its surroundings. Urza had told Tanos of the engine and had said that Mishra found it beneath the desert. But this was no Thran creation, Tanos thought. It was far removed from the chief artificer's Avengers, as a living bird differed from an ornithopter. Tanos was impressed, and that was with a prior warning from Urza. He could only imagine what the rest of the populace was thinking. The dragon engine was in harness, like a caravan ox, and pulled the huge wagon almost as large as itself. The wain, though, held no sense of wonder, as did the mechanical beast harnessed to it. The wagon looked like a metallic 4-story inn that had been suddenly given wheels and turned loose on the world. Its sharp angles and exposed rivets marked it as originally being of Thran design. Numerous portals and battlements bristled along its flanks, set with catapults and small ballista. The weapons were unloaded for the moment and wrapped beneath tarps that no more concealed their purpose than the banners did the walls of Krug. Kayla had ordered the ornithopters displayed outside the walls, 1 flight to either side of the north gate. They were on the ground, their crews standing ready next to them. They were intended both as reassurance and as warning, much as a sheathed sword laid upon a table might remind everyone that, while there was no intention of treachery, the negotiations were prepared to fight. The pilots in blue and white tabards waited patiently by their machines. The Falaji formed a line opposite them, a respectful distance away. The dragon engine and its burden drew up before the gates and came to a rest at last. As it did so, Tanos noted something Urza had not mentioned. A dull throbbing came from the beast as fluids gurgled through hidden tubes and hydraulic joints shifted in place. The humming was akin to a heartbeat, and Tanos could feel it, more than he could hear it. The machines came to rest, and after a short interval, a door opened in the side of the great wain. A staircase lowered, and down the stairs came two figures. Neither was the Qadir. Instead, Mishra led the way, followed by his assistant. Tanos had not met either, yet from the way Mishra carried himself, Tanos knew he must be Urza's brother. The younger brother was shorter, heavier, and dark-haired with a tightly trimmed beard. There was something in his walk, and the face beneath that beard that marked him as kin to the chief artificer of Krug, prince consort of Yosha. Mishra was bedecked in the flowering robes of a desert prince, his head bare and his face beaming with a great smile. He blinked in the afternoon sun and waved to the crowds on the battlement. There were catcalls among the responding cheers, but the younger brother seemed not to notice. Yet much as the wain was diminished by the dragon engine that served it, so too was Mishra dimmed by his companion. She was a slender woman with hair the color of blood-stained rubies, dressed in dark clothes, a flowing cape billowing behind her. She carried a simple, unadorned staff of black wood and seemingly did not recognize the crowd's shouts, for she kept her gaze forward. From Urza's description, Tanos knew this must be Ashnod. No Qadir emerged from the metallic wain, and in the gatehouse the ocean leaders held a quick conference. The Qadir was not present, noted the Essential, then the Queen should not appear either for the initial welcoming. A group similar in protocol should respond to the Falaji's initial delegation. More might be taken as a sign of weakness, less as an insult. That meant Urza and Tanos would greet the new arrivals. The chief artificer nodded, his face stiffening slightly as he saw his brother on the field. Tanos thought the artificer would rather speak with his brother privately, but this was not to be. The Queen would remain at the gatehouse as the artificer and his apprentice met the Falaji representatives. Urza was stiff and formal as they crossed the open space between the city and the Falaji. Tanos kept an appropriate 2 paces behind to the right, marshalling his own features to a calm demeanor. Urza stopped before Mishra and Ashnod and without preamble raised his empty hand slightly, as if he were a priest giving benediction. "Welcome to Krug, brother," he said. Mishra flung both arms outward, and for a moment Tanos thought the younger brother was going to rush his elder and hug him. Instead, Mishra bowed deeply. Tanos noted that Ashnod gave a short bob of the head as well. "We are honored by your invitation," said Mishra, rising again. The smile on his face could be earnest, thought Tanos, or could be a pasted-on smile of a Falaji traitor. "We are honored by your presence," said Urza, though his words sounded to Tanos' ears dry and bloodless. "Is your Qadir with you?" "Alas," said Mishra, bowing again deeply, "I fear that his most wise and earnest presence could not accompany us on our mission of peace and mercy. Our empire is wide now, and there are other matters that require his attention." Urza was silent for a moment, and Tanos could see the muscles tighten along his jawline. "We should have been told if your leader was otherwise occupied," he said at last. "We understand your disappointment," Mishra said quickly. "Be assured that it is shared by our most puissant and powerful master. After his last experience with your people, he wishes to be cautious. He has entrusted to me the power to negotiate fully on his behalf. However, if we are unwelcome because of his absence, we apologize and will humbly retreat the way we came." He bowed a third time. Tanos realized the younger brother was not making his exaggerated movements for Urza, but rather for the large number of Yoshans lining the walls. Even if the chief artificer had wanted to, he could not send the Falaji representatives away. Tanos held his face in a mask of solemn indifference, as he had back when the lad had listened to his uncle speak. He kept his eyes forward, looking past Mishra into the middle distance. After a few moments, he realized he was looking at Ashnod, over her master's left shoulder. She, too, had the impassive look on her face of a child who is expected to behave herself while the parents talk. Tanos blinked, realizing the red-haired woman might think he was staring at her, and moved his gaze a few feet to the left toward one of the wheels of the great metal wain. As he did so, Ashnod caught his eye and winked. It was a flutter, accompanied by a ghost of a smile. Tanos started, his eyes darting back to the scarlet-haired woman, but by the time her face was an impassive diplomatic mask. All this occurred in the time it took for Urza to respond. "You are welcome as the representative of your people," he said. "Let me present you to the Queen, if you will follow me." A brief bow here, and Mishra added softly, "And let me say you are looking well, brother. I would have been heartbroken if you had perished at Corlinda." "It is," began Urza, and paused. The world seemed to turn around them for a moment. Then he continued, "It is good to know you are safe as well. About Corlinda," Mishra held up a hand. "We can speak of the matter at length. Let me say that I have given it much thought over the past year. We will talk, But for the moment, we should not keep your queen waiting. Urza's face tightened for a moment, then relaxed, and he nodded. Of course. With that, he spun on his heel and walked back toward the gate. Mishra followed, accompanied by the woman. Thomas brought up the rear. The red-haired woman hesitated as she passed the apprentice. She turned slightly and said, "You must be Tanos." She held out her hand. Automatically, Tanos took her fingers and bowed slightly over them. "I'm sorry, yes, I'm Tanos, apprentice to Urza. You are Mishra's chief apprentice, Ashnod?" Ashnod withdrew her hand, and again a small smile played over her face. "Chief and only," she said. "It's typical of those two that they wouldn't bother to introduce us. Brilliant as he is, he sometimes has the social graces of an Atog. Must run in the family, eh?" Tanos tried to form a response, but by the time he had thought of something relatively innocuous, she had turned back and was following the two brothers toward the gate. Tanos shook his head slightly and brought up the rear, arriving at the gate as Urza was presenting Kayla, rolling off her various titles like a schoolmaster reading the roll. "Flower of the Mardun, Warlord's daughter, Queen of the Oceans, and War Lady of Krug, my wife, Kayla bin Krug," concluded Urza. "Mishra, the representative chosen of the Falaji, the Kadir was unable to attend and begs our forgiveness." Tanos noted that Urza was looking at the Sensual as he said it, and that the nervous man flinched at the implied accusation. Kayla offered her hand to the younger brother. "Urza spoke to me of your beauty," said Mishra, bowing deeply over her hand, "but I had forgotten his capacity for understatement. For him, a majestic tree is only so many board feet of lumber, and a desert vista only so many miles to cross, so, too, I see that he has seriously unvalued your charm." A small smile played across Kayla's face. Tanos thought the queen was amused, though she had long since become immune to fulsome praise. "Urza has spoken of his brother, but I must admit I was unprepared for one so eloquent." "I have a few regrets in my life," said Mishra, still grasping at the queen's hand lightly, "and one of them is that I never had a sister. With you as my brother's wife, that is now remedied." With that, he loosened her hand, and she gently withdrew it. There were other introductions, Ashnod, Tanos, the Sensual, and the captain of the guard, and arrangements were made for the Falaji to bivouac around their dragon engine. But the part that Tanos remembered later, after it was all said and done, was the stony stare with which Urza favored his younger brother as Mishra flattered Kayla, and Mishra's toothy white smile as he regarded his brother's wife. Sounds of the fight carried all the way down the hall. Tanos had to pass a gaggle of chambermaids speeding away from the royal quarters. Then he heard the arguing voices reverberate like steel balls against the surrounding walls. Closer still, the air itself gained weight and potency. He felt it as if it were back at the seacoast watching a squall wade ashore, pushing the air in front of it. Undeterred, he pressed forward. The door to the quarters was shut. That did little to blunt the noises from within. This close, Tanos could make out the words, and he paused for a moment before knocking. "The answer is no!" shouted Urza. "It's a good trade," rejoined Kayla just as loudly. "They will leave the sword marchers alone." "It's not yours to trade away," thundered Urza. Tanos had never heard the chief artificer that loud before, even when he was bawling out of the most incompetent of apprentices. Tanos hesitated at the door. Would it be better to interrupt, make them aware their fight was resounding through the palace, or to wait for a lull in the shouting? Tanos knocked. There was a testy growl of "What?" from the other side, coupled with a more feminine, disciplined "Enter." Tanos entered the room cautiously and said, "The Falaji delegation is waiting for the tour of the ordinary, Chief Artificer?" Urza shot his apprentice a look as frosty as the Ranum Glacier. Yes, thought Tanos, this was particularly bad time to interrupt. Across the room, Kayla was standing, hands folded in front of her. In the Privy Council, that usually meant that a particular subject was closed. "If you want me to conduct the tour," added Tanos, but Urza had already had his hand up. "I'll be there," said the Chief Artificer, as Tanos knew he would. The idea of his brother padding through his research area without Urza being present was unthinkable. To his wife, Urza snapped, "This discussion is not over, my wife." Kayla nodded curtly. "You are correct, my husband." Urza gave a sharp half bow, then left the room. Kayla said, "Tanos, remain a moment." Tanos looked at the Chief Artificer. Urza scowled, then gave Tanos a nod. "Come along when you can," he said, and then he was gone, his formal cape billowing behind him. Tanos turned back to the Queen. "Your Majesty," he said, then added, "Ma'am." "You heard our discussion out in the hall?" she said. Tanos took a deep breath. "I think they heard your discussion in the domes of Tamakul." Kayla smiled and slumped into one of her chairs, a heavy throne-like monster with ornately carved arms. I did not hear much of it, continued Tanos quickly. The stonework carries the intensity, but not the nature of your words. Kayla laced her hands, templed her fingers, and touched them to her lips. Would you say the talks have gone well these past few days? Very well, replied Tanos, and indeed they had verged on phenomenal. Considering the abortive talks in Corlinda, gifts had been presented, toasts had been exchanged, platitudes had been spoken, and effusive compliments had been offered. Private meetings between Kayla and Mishra had led to discussions among the Falaji and in the Privy Council. The good feelings between the two sides had culminated in Urza's offer to show his brother his ornery. In return, Mishra had offered to let Urza and his assistant look at the dragon engine in the Great Wain. Things were going very well indeed. And Ambassador Mishra, asked Kayla, your opinion of him? Tanos hesitated, unsure of what Kayla wanted to know. He is... The apprentice searched for words. He is like his brother, only different, more effusive, more willing to talk. But no less guarded, said Kayla. Tanos thought for a moment. Yes, despite all the talk and praise and compliments, Mishra remained even more closed than his brother. He seemed earnest, but was his earnestness the truth or only a mask? Tanos realized he would never think of Urza in that fashion. I rarely know what Urza is thinking, but that is because he is quiet. I don't know what Mishra is thinking because he's talking. Kayla gave a smile and said, He is very charming, and I have heard that the desert traders have the ability to talk a snake out of its skin. Do you think he has the ability to enforce any deal made here? Tanos nodded. He brought the dragon engine with him. The men who follow him apparently think well of him. Kayla was silent for a moment, then said, Do you think we can trust him? Tanos held up his hands. I don't think we have given him much chance to prove our trust so far. Indeed, said Kayla, and pressed her fingers to her lips. What if I were to tell you that Mishra was prepared to sign a treaty recognizing Yosha's claim to the sword marches? Amazed, Tanos said, The Kadir is willing to do this? Kayla held up a finger. I said what if. Diplomacy is filled with what ifs, idle ideas that are launched. If they fail to fly, they are quickly denied or more quickly forgotten. Like prototypes in the ordinary, smiled Tanos, and he thought about the nature of the offer. What would be the price for such a boon? Kayla nodded. Their declared price involves protection of the Falaji natives among our populace, guards for their caravans within our land, and a token payment for the land seized, but no formal apology for seizing it, along with a recognition of the Kadir as ruler of the united Falaji people. In national terms, these are very small things indeed, but there is one last piece, and that is the sticking point. Kayla was quiet for a moment, and Tanos did not interrupt the pause. When she spoke again, it was in cool tones. What are the abilities of Urza's stone, the one he wears around his neck? His might stone? Said Tanos. Light broke over him. Mishra wants his brother's talisman? What does it do? Persisted Kayla. He is rarely without it. Tanos thought about what he had seen Urza do with the stone. Slowly he replied, It seems to make artifacts and creatures more powerful within a limited range. He uses it to heal flawed power crystals, but it seems to work that way only in his hands, and he holds it when he's thinking, though that may just be force of habit. Good Sir Mishra has his own stone, mate to his brother's, said Kayla. Has he told you that? Tanos was silent for a moment, then shook his head. I was surprised at that as well, the more so that it was Mishra who told me, said Kayla, a ripple of irritation evident in her voice. So the stone has some power, and Mishra wants it. Mishra said his stone sang to him. Does Urza's stone sing? Not that I have noticed, said Tanos. Nor I, agreed Kayla. The ambassador may be using some desert idiom I'm not familiar with, so it may just be a flowery illusion. Yet the fact remains that Mishra is willing to guarantee peace, backed by his dragon engine and other devices he has hinted at, all if Urza will give up his stone. Tanos shook his head. Urza would not do this, I think. You think correctly, said Kayla gloomily. Hence the discussion that shook the halls of this palace. The Queen of Yosha placed her palms together, fingers extended, and twisted them a quarter turn against each other, then back. It struck Tanos that he had seen Urza use the same mannerism when faced with a problem in design. He wondered if the Queen had picked it up the habit from her prince consort, or the chief artificer from his royal wife. I do not think it would do the nation harm if Mishra was to get the other half of his stone, she said. But it might do Urza harm, replied Tanos. In doing so, it could harm the nation. Agreed, said Kayla, again twisting her palms against each other, then setting them down in her lap. But can I let this opportunity pass by? Am I condemning the storm marches to continual raids and the rest of the country to a constant military footing because of an item coveted by both brothers? Tanos was silent for a moment, then said, Urza is right. Kayla's face fell, but Tanos added, You both need to talk more on the subject. You and Urza, you and Mishra and Urza themselves. Perhaps there's some common ground that frees the sword marches. Perhaps Mishra's merely testing the waters, trying the prototype of an idea to see what your reaction is. Perhaps he asks for the stone and will settle for something else, something you don't know he wants yet. Kayla sighed. These are the problems of rulership. There are some situations that resist all easy solutions. Which is why I'm trying to avoid providing you with any, said Tanos. Kayla nodded. Your talents are wasted at Urza's apprentice, Tanos. You would make an excellent seneschal. Tanos winced comically. You already have an excellent seneschal. And were I not Urza's apprentice, who would you talk to about the prince consort? That sally brought a true smile to Kayla Binkrug's face. Agreed. Now be off with you. Be sure to tell me later how the brothers are getting along. Tanos rejoined the chief artificer at the ornery as Urza was explaining the better control of the wing surface with the double bend structure. Mishra was attentive and seemed to ask all the right questions, leading Urza each time into his next point. Urza, for his part, was scholarly, but not pedantic about his work. To Tanos, there seemed to be no friction between the brothers, and he deemed it likely that the subject of the stone had not arisen on either side. Tanos looked around. Most of the rest of Falagi seemed bored beyond human conception, and the students present had heard most of Urza's explanations before. They were staring at odd bits of the ornery, trying to keep from falling asleep. Ashnod, however, was watching Tanos. When he looked her way, she turned her head back to where the two brothers were discussing. Then, as soon as he turned away, he could feel the pressure of her eyes on him. It made him very uncomfortable. Tanos had assumed from what Urza had said that Ashnod was Mishra's lover as well as his student, yet the two did not behave as intimates, and that earlier wink, if it were truly a wink, and now the stares that were not stares told a different story entirely. The talk lasted through most of the early afternoon. Mishra made a number of small suggestions of his own concerning the design, while Urza pointed out what other changes they would necessitate. Finally it became clear they would not have the time to tour the Dragon Engine as well that evening, and indeed there would be much rushing about if that evening's state dinner was to go off as planned. Mishra was effusive in his apologies. I can see that you have achieved much here. Once there is peace, I hope to be able to establish my own small foundry and laboratory, he said. When you do, responded Urza, let me send you the notes on my teaching experience. I've discovered that certain methods work better than others in holding the attention of young men. As if we never had that problem when we were young, said Mishra with a laugh, and Urza managed a tight smile. Yes, thought Tanos. Urza had not entirely forgotten the argument with Kayla, but he was not going to let it spill out before his brother. It would not be he who created an incident, not he who spoiled his wife's hope for peace. The state dinner was held within the great courtyard, an open-air celebration in the Falagi style to honor the guests. Every cushion and throw rug in the palace was pressed into service, and a fine repast of roast lamb spiced chicken was laid out for the attendees, who sprawled alongside the low tables. The Falagi, after too many suppers and stiff-backed chairs, were noticeably at ease, whereas the Yotians continually shifted and moved to find suitable resting places. The Seneschal had found a band of Murhan musicians. The city had no qualms about playing for members of the Suadi clan, and the air was filled with their high-pitched strings and hearty shouts. Kayla sat with Urza on one side of her, Mishra on the other. She spoke with both, though she was mostly attentive to her husband, at one point offering him a date stuffed with cheese. He did not let her feed him, but rather took the fruit from her hand and smiled at her, popping the treat into his mouth. Those city folk who watched the royal couple were no doubt delighted by their display of affection. To Tanos it was a sign that perhaps the storm in their private quarters had blown over. Mishra, for his part, when talking to Kayla, continually extolled some virtue or another of desert life. The meal ran 8 courses, in the Yotian tradition, but all the courses were of Falagi dishes. In addition to the lamb and chicken, there was broiled fish done with hot peppers, salads of spinach and goat cheese, and all manners of salted meats. Everything was served with a pungent wine smelling of cinnamon. The wine, called Nabis, was as potent as it was pungent, and Tanos noted that a number of the Yotians used it to offset the discomforts of the sprawling across the pillows. Most of his table consisted of Falagi lieutenants who laughed among themselves, and once, when a recognizable tune appeared from the band, rose to engage in a long line dance. Mishra joined them, keeping pace with their kicks and flourishes. A shadow moved along Tawnos' side. "Interesting, no?" asked Ashnod as she settled down next to Tawnos. "Traditional warriors' dance," replied Tawnos. Ashnod held out her cup, one of the gold ones from the warlord's 10th anniversary celebration. Tawnos reached for the ewer of Nabis and refilled the goblet. Ashnod made a rude noise at Tawnos' words. "It's one more boys-only tradition," she said with a slight slur in her voice, and Tawnos wondered how much wine she had had already. "The Falaji are typically chauvinist and the Swardi the worst of the pack. Mishra had to practically club the Qadir over the head to agree to negotiate with a woman in the first place. Women should be out raising the children, baking flatbread, not getting involved in politics, war, religion, science, or any of the rest of that boys' stuff." Tawnos did not let his surprise at Ashnod's words show. "Time changes for all of us," he said. "Perhaps the Falaji will change as well." "Not in my lifetime, or in yours," returned Ashnod. She pressed a slim hand against her bare breastbone and stifled a burp. "They are here, negotiating with a woman, and things are going well, and you, a woman, are among their number," Tawnos said. "I am merely tolerated," replied the red-haired woman. "I am Mishra's apprentice and assistant. The great Mishra is as much the leader of the Falaji now as the Qadir, and the chiefs trust him more than they do the fat young pup currently running things. So they put up with me. And the Falaji legends say things about dangerous women with red hair." She sat down her cup and ran both hands through her long tresses, arching her back as she did so. "So they fear me as well." "Should they?" asked Tawnos. He knew he was feeling the effects of the Nabi's work through his system as well, but he could not suppress his interest in the woman. "Fear me?" said Ashnod with a devilish smile. "I'd like to think so. But if Mishra left them tomorrow, I would be gone as well before nightfall. Of that I have no doubt." Tawnos made no comment and instead looked at the dancers. Most of the Falaji had joined the dance, which had transformed from a line into a spiral curling in on itself. Mishra led the procession, had enticed the spindly Sensual to accompany him. The bird-like man tried to mimic Mishra's steps and did an admirable job miming the steps, bows, and shouts. Other members of the palace staff had joined the procession, but both unfamiliarity and spiced wine worked against them, reducing them to mere shufflers in the procession. The Falaji did not seem to mind, and in fact seemed to spur them on to increased gyrations and bellows. "Things are going very well," said Tawnos. "Better than you could imagine," said Ashnod softly. "What did you think of the ornery?" asked Tawnos. "More impressive than I expected," replied Ashnod, shaking her hair back. "Master Mishra is jealous, you know. Not that he'd admit it. But he's been talking about getting a place to set up his own work for years. I think that's why he wants the peace treaty. He's been recruiting artisans from Tomakul and Zegon, but he has no permanent place for them." Tawnos nodded. Ashnod was sharing more than she should, but he had no problems listening to her. "Still," he said, "it is a pity we ran long at the ornery. I would have liked to have examined." Tawnos stared into her stormy eyes and almost lost his thought. "Mishra's dragon engine," he finished lamely. "Who's to say you can't?" asked Ashnod. "Well, there's always tomorrow," said Tawnos. Ashnod shook her head. "Not tomorrow, tonight." Tawnos stared at her. "There's a banquet going on." "Later," said Ashnod. "Listen, can you get past the ocean guards in our wing of the palace?" Tawnos thought for a moment. "They know me. I don't think there would be a problem." "And I can get past the brass hats guarding the engine," said the woman, shaking her head again. "They know me, fear me, remember? I can give you a private tour. Interested?" Tawnos stammered for a moment, and Ashnod added, "Come on, we're supposed to be students. That means we can occasionally play hooky. You've never played hooky?" "Never," said Tawnos, and realized he was blushing. "Well, hardly ever. You?" Ashnod's face became suddenly stern, mocking her companion. "Never," she said in a low, masculine tone, then smiled and winked. A definite wink this time. "Well, hardly ever. So are you interested?" Tawnos realized that it might be an opportunity to gain additional insight into Mishra for the Queen and the Chief Artificer. "Yes," he said at last. "I think I'd like that." "Dandy," said Ashnod, rising smoothly from her seat without a sign of the effects of the alcohol she'd been consuming. "After the midnight bell, then, come to my quarters, and bring a civilized, decent dry wine, will you? All this desert wine is like liquefied candy." With that, she was gone, disappearing along the edges of the cluster of drunken Falaji in the oceans, all bellowing and shuffling to the music, forming an ever-growing maelstrom of celebrants.